Hi everyone. My name's Kalantha Brigham. I'm a chapter counsellor here at the Institute of Architects and chair of the fabulous New South Wales Gender Equity Task Force, also known as GET. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge we're meeting here on traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. On behalf of GET, I'd like to welcome you all here for an important event tonight focused on gender equity, leadership and cultural change. Achieving gender equity within our profession is an imperative with strong moral and ethical dimensions. But tonight we're also going to hear there's a strong business case for change. Latest research reveals positive correlations between financial performance and diversity in leadership. Diverse companies are better able to win top talent, attract, offer more varied solutions and enjoy the benefit of employee satisfaction and staff retention. Diversity in experience also brings diversity in design. It pays to invest in gender equity. Tonight you're going to hear a number of presentations from keynote speakers. Sean beside me is going to give a little intro. Naomi will give a talk and give us a briefing about what the research tells us about the state of gender in the profession. We'll welcome Elizabeth to speak on the challenge of cultural change and why leadership is important. Peter will speak to why male champions are necessary, what it means to be a champion. Then Sean and I will announce who the champions are for the Institute this year. And then we'll have a 40-minute panel session, so we'd just like you to hold questions and ask them at that point in time. And then afterwards we'd like you all to join us for food and drinks and just to generally celebrate this great event. So I'd now like to invite Sean Carter, New South Wales Chapter President and Convener of our inaugural Institute Champions program, to welcome you and say a few words before we move on.
Well, hello, and a great turnout, a great audience tonight. An audience that I'd hoped for, an audience where we've packed the place. This is rare, it doesn't happen all that often. It says that this sort of audience says to me that the architecture profession gets it. An audience that says to me that as a profession we are ready to tackle the challenge of gender equity. Today, on my first official day as New South Wales Chapter President, I'm here to support this talk, but also to help launch the Institute's Champions of Change program. I'm also here tonight to tell you that the Institute and the profession sees the symptoms and understands the problems of gender inequity in the workplace. And the symptoms, here they are. Look at this graphic of male participation compared to female participation in the profession. I don't think you need me to tell you that that small circle right at the very end there is female participation. To me, this is shocking. We just can't keep on losing this much talent. We can't, as a profession, think we can grow our influence and impact if we can't stop this brain drain. We can't, as a profession, we can't expand the profession, to lift it, to raise it in the public's mind, in the minds of government and business, if we continue to reinforce the status quo. And let's face it, the status quo is an old boys club. And this shocking statistic is a symptom to the problem. The problem is we're missing the positive effects of gender equity. So I hear you say, what are the positive effects of gender equity? They are difference of a creative opinion, better financial models, better balance between time and income, God forbid, more profit. Staff retention, staff morale, happy staff are productive staff, a greater ability to attract and employ talent. And for me, it's no coincidence that the leading design firms in New South Wales, the firms that are winning the best work, that are winning the awards, are the firms that get it. They are prepared to tackle head-on gender inequity in the workplace. They see it as a business and architectural advantage. They recognise talent and they want to keep it. It's why these 10 male CEOs have enthusiastically embraced the Institute's Champions of Change program. So why is it suddenly all about men? Why are we here today focusing on engaging men in the Institute's Champions of Change program? This is what male champion of change Gordon Cairns said on men. Men invented the system, men largely run the system, men need to change the system. You see, this is not about excluding women, it's about including men. And that's the crux of Champions of Change, to get men involved. Change starts at the top. The Institute's Champions of Change program invites male CEOs, managing directors and principals of 10 leading firms to become Gender Equity Champions of Change. You'll hear tonight in detail how the program works. For me, it's an exciting time to be the president of the New South Wales chapter, to be here, to be supporting our Gender Equity Task Force, to play my part in an important initiative that will deliver real change. This is why you run for an office like this. Thank you. Now, I'll introduce the first speaker, and our first speaker will be Dr. Naomi Steed. A quick citation. Naomi is a member of the Institute's Architects National Gender Equity Committee, an associate professor at the University of Queensland and a lead researcher from the ARC research project Equity and Diversity in the Australian Architecture Profession, Women, Work and Leadership. Please welcome Naomi to the stage.
Thanks very much, Sean. I'm really delighted to be here this evening. Thank you all for coming. So, as Sean mentioned, for the past 4 years or so, I've been involved with this project, which is an Australian Research Council funded research project with a very unwieldy title and involving many, many people. You can see there the research team itself was very large, including myself and Justine Clark, who's here, and others. And I particularly would like to acknowledge Jill Matthewson, who's doing a PhD within the project, a hotly anticipated PhD, shortly to be completed. And also our industry partners. We take every opportunity to thank our industry partners who put their money where their mouths were at the beginning of this project, and they included the Australian Institute of Architects at a national level, Architecture Media, BVN, Bates Smart and PTW. So this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for their support, and we continue to thank them because I think it's had significant ongoing effects. So, does architecture have issues with gender equity and full participation of women? I would say yes. I would say unequivocally yes. And I would argue that the evidence is overwhelming, and I'll show you some of the evidence in the coming slides. Is the architecture profession willing to believe it has a problem with gender equity and full participation of women? Not so much. In the past, not so much. But increasingly, I think that's the case, and the fact that you are all here tends to indicate that people actually are beginning to acknowledge now that there is a problem, and now that we know there's a problem, it's incumbent upon us to do something about it. Is architecture any different from every other industry? I think there's been a strong belief in architecture that we are different, that we're exceptional, that we are incomparable with any other profession. And I think that's very arguable. I think that in many ways we're not different at all. I think there are some particularities and local cultural issues which are perhaps unusual, but generally speaking, the issues that we face in architecture are relatively common. I'll be very interested to hear Elizabeth speak more about that. But I think there's been a tendency in architecture to say, but we're the good guys. We're interested in social justice. We believe in working for the public realm. We are socially progressive. How could we be bad? And in fact, the point here is that the inequitable effects in architecture are almost universally accidental. I don't think we don't have major issues with discrimination, although there is some discrimination, of course. But there are accidental inequitable effects which affect the full participation of women and are a problem. And if we think that the problem lies with engineers, it lies with builders, it lies with clients, it lies with all the blokes around the table who aren't architects, well, that's a real problem because we won't look to change our own culture. We need to put our own house in order before we start trying to blame the builders. So So in this presentation, I'm going to summarise 4 years of research in 10 minutes, so hang on to your hat. I'm going to talk very quickly about 3 distinct bodies of research and 3 separate sets of findings. First of all, I'm going to talk about the statistical mapping, which was really encapsulated in this diagram, which you can't really see at all, I imagine. So it's a statistical mapping. And why do we look at statistics? Because that enables us to look at women as a group. Not individuals, not those individual successful women who've made it and everything's been fine for them, but the group. So when we start to look at the collective, we start to see the structural and systemic issues that apply across the board. I think in architecture in the past there's been a problem that the discourse has been at the level of the anecdote. We've been talking about individuals and not about the collective, and so it's been hard to be conclusive about what the problems are. I think this statistical mapping enables us to say much more firmly where the problems lie. So that's the first bit. The second bit, I will talk very briefly about a series of surveys that we did under the organisation PALA, which Justine will talk a little bit more about later. And third, I'll talk just briefly about the outcomes of some consultation we did when we prepared a set of guides, PALA guides to equitable practice, which I think is some kind of good news for me to end on. So looking at this diagram, which is, as I say, complex, but it summarises really the main points of the research. So we can see that at every level, by every measure, women are underrepresented in architecture. Teaching staff, 36% of teaching staff are women, but they're clustered in the low-level positions. In particular, senior lecturers and below. The proportion of women who are professors is 12%, very low. Women getting up to the very senior, most influential levels of the profession. While 44% of all students are women, that's coming pretty close to parity, that's a good news story. 45% of first-year students last year, 44% of graduates. But we see that the number of women who are registered is 21%. Something's happening here. There's a gap. It's very clear in membership of the Institute. Women are vastly clustered in student membership and non-practicing types of membership, graduates and students. But the number of fellows and national presidents is so minuscule, can barely be registered. National presidents. You can see it also in the types of membership. So directors, women directors 11%, women partners 14%. You can see it in the census data as well. So 28% of people who self-identified as architects in the census were women. But once again, you see that they're not in the most influential roles. They're more likely to be employees and much less likely to be owners of unincorporated or incorporated enterprises. So I'm going to start off by summarising our overall findings, and they are that women are underrepresented in the architecture profession in Australia. This is particularly apparent at senior levels. But the proportion of female graduates is close to parity, but women are not advancing in proportionate numbers. Women architects tend to follow atypical career paths, which of course is making you think, oh, what's a typical career path and how is that gendered male? Trained women tend to leave the profession, step sideways or not return from a break. There is evidence of gender-based pay inequity, quite strong evidence. There's evidence of the sidelining of architects working part-time. Of course that affects both men and women, but it's disproportionately women that work part-time, which is a very difficult path for an architect. And low pay, long hours and difficulty reconciling professional and family life are also problems for men in architecture, but they impact in different, specific and compounded ways for women. So what we don't want to have is a conversation about how it's also hard for men. Of course it's also hard for men, but it's harder for women, would be the argument that I would make. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about the universities, where I would say things are not too bad. They're not brilliant, but they're not too bad. There's work to be done, but there are other areas where I think our attention is more warranted. So there are 18 architecture schools in Australia. In 2011, there were 9,222 students. Across the 2 degrees, 42% of them were women. And you can see that's a climbing graph. The purple is the total, grey is male, yellow is female. It's coming close to parity. This is a different graph showing the proportion of women graduating from architecture schools increasing rapidly from the mid-80s to the mid-90s and then levelling off. From 1990 to 99, women averaged 40% of all graduates. In the following decade, this increased to 41% of all graduates and it's now 44%. So as you can see, it's trending upward. But the point of me showing this graph is that it's not a pipeline issue. We've been saying that women are underrepresented for at least 30 years, and that lump of 40% of graduates has not followed through to the senior, most influential levels of the profession. It's not that we can just wait and it will fix itself. It doesn't work like that. It's not just a matter of letting the women come through. You've already seen a version of this graph, but I want to particularly draw your attention to the gap between the graduating proportion and the practicing proportion. So 7% in the age range 40 to 44, 37% of graduates are female, but only 30% of practitioners. Where's the 7%? And the gap is very significant across the board. So this tells us again, in actually quite a literal way, that it's not just a pipeline issue. It's closer to what they call in the literature a leaky pipeline. So women are leaking. And why women are leaking in specific places, we need to work out where and why and stop the leak. So moving on from statistics about the universities and students, and I barely need to say that female students do just as well as male students, in some cases, well, exceptionally well. We've all known brilliant women students who left architecture school with honours and then went on and were unable to fulfil their promise. And in the Parlour surveys, I have to say, it was pretty heartbreaking, some of the narratives that came through there, because these women who really had been brilliant, very talented, and could have been very influential on the profession, had been felt that they'd been forced out of architecture, not by choice, but because it was not by choice. And these are heartbreaking stories. They were not able to fulfil their potential, and it was a great loss for the profession and for the world. Those people should have been great architects, and they weren't given the opportunity. So this is a pretty striking pair of graphs as well. So this is, once again, from the census. It tells us that women were 4,138 of self-reported architects in the census, 2,079 registered architects, that is to say 50% of women were registered, 73% of men were registered, but look at the age discrepancy. Women are yellow, men are blue. Men are hanging on, women are not hanging on. Something is making the women leave. And this perhaps is part of it. This is once again from the census. Women are orange, men are green. The pay gap. This is a summary of all architects, but that's a pretty significant pay gap. This is from the census. This is irrefutable data. And I'll show you a bit more detail on the pay gap. You can see that it's, once again, this is the all architects chart. It's not a big issue in the 20 to 24 year old range, pretty much level. Not a big problem there, I would say. Likewise, in the 25 to 29 year range, men are a little higher, not all that significantly. Look at this. What happens when women turn 30? It's not good. This is why we sometimes find that women under 30 are at pains to point out that there is no problem. They have not experienced a problem. They wish we would stop saying there was a problem. But in fact, when they hit 30, it may well be that they suddenly have an enlightenment. This graph, which is also from the census, talks about the kinds of roles that women are in architecture, which tend to be the less influential roles. They're much less likely to own a business, they're much more likely to be an employee. So if you wanted to be melodramatic about it, or perhaps provocative, you could say that women architects are something of a precarious underclass, underpaid and undervalued, often invisible. So personally, I find it quite astonishing that prior to our research, the profession didn't have this knowledge, didn't seem to think that this knowledge was worthwhile or important, not just about gender, but about the demographics of the profession across the whole country as a whole. The engineers, for example, have very good information on the demographics of who is an engineer, how do they work, where do they work, how old are they, what mode do they work in. In architecture, we had no such information. I mean, that's pretty striking, right? If you were running a business and you had no such information about your own staff, you'd think that you were being pretty lax. But we didn't have this information about the profession nationally, And it is amazing that the profession knew so little about itself and didn't see the value in knowing more. Now that we do know, I would argue it's incumbent upon us to act upon this knowledge. So what did we do about it? The research project originally conceived of producing a website as a kind of dissemination tool for our findings. I mean, I have to say, I had an idea for some kind of humble little WordPress thing, but Justine was on board, and so of course, you know, it became a very grand affair, and it became the thing known as Parler, Women Equity Architecture. Parler, with the title being a play on the French parler, a space to speak, has become more than a space for disseminating research. It's become a research tool in itself. It's also become a space of conversation where practitioners and members of the profession contribute essays, conversations, and content. So that's one of the things that we did with the project, and it's fair to say Parler has been fairly successful. I think it's fair to say it's been more successful than any of us imagined. And it's had a lot of visitors. When you think there's around 10,000 architects in Australia, you think, well, why on earth has his website had 67,000 visitors? And the answer is, it's difficult to see this, but this is the international distribution of people who are reading Parler, and as you can see, it's a global conversation. It just happens, I think, that we produced it at a moment when this was a problem across the board, it was a problem across the world, people wanted to talk about it, they wanted an informed source of research which was not overtly partisan or hysterical, and Parler seemed to fit that bill. So the kind of accidental but happy effect of that is that Australia is now being seen as a world leader in this area. I think for many years we were not in terms of actual effect. So for many years I think Australia was well behind, and there's been a lot of research which showed we had a problem, several reports over some decades, and they just hadn't gone anywhere, they gathered dust. But now the RIBA and the American Institute of Architects are looking to us and looking to the Australian Institute as a kind of like an example of what they might perhaps do. So Parler continues to be an instrument for collecting research, and we did, as you may know, a series of surveys back in 2012, 2013. First of all, where do all the women go, which had 1,377 responses, and followed by, and what about the men, which had 918 responses, which I have to say we were surprised by. We thought men would not be so engaged with this issue, but they really were. Now we have to treat the results of these surveys with some caution because the respondents were self-selected, which is to say they were already interested in this issue, and therefore that may have coloured their responses. But I think with the numbers like this, while we can't say that it's a population-wide, we can't draw conclusions about the population as a whole, we can say that it stands for the people who responded, and we can also note that the demographics of the people who responded map reasonably well across the demographics of architects in the census. And it's also true that it's also true that something I forgot.
Definitely it's true.
I'm not going to go through those results in detail because they're long and elaborate and endlessly fascinating, but we don't have much time. So the point that I wanted to make with this one is just that the Parler surveys only reinforced everything that we had already got from the census. So I know what I was going to say. The numbers are high enough to represent a pretty good sample. 1,300 women architects out of a population of around 4,000 is not too bad. So it's reasonably a bit representative. So the point here is that it only reinforces the idea that men and women are working in different ways. Women more likely respondents, more likely to be employees, less likely to be employers, that's blue. You can see a clear distinction there. Less likely to be self-employed, etc. Salary discrepancy, not unlike what we saw in the census data. And in terms of seniority, men here in blue, more likely to be principals and directors, practice principals, associate principals, etc. This is a pretty fascinating graph about hours worked per week on average as compared to hours actually employed to work, and that tells us that everyone's working very long hours. So what are the findings from the surveys? In summary, women respondents were much more likely to be employees, less likely than male respondents to be employers or self-employed. There was a notable salary discrepancy. Obviously, it was women who earned less. Women were clustered in relatively junior roles and significantly underrepresented at senior levels. Both women and men with an architectural training work in a huge range of fields and doing a huge range of tasks. Now, this is important because if we only count architects as registered project architects, well, that's missing a hell of a lot of women who are working in the profession, who might be not registered, or who might be working not necessarily in private practice as a project architect, but slightly peripheral to the mainstream. Women and men work in different ways in architecture. Women are much more likely to work part-time and more likely to perceive this as having been detrimental to their careers. A high proportion of both women and men in architecture work in a flexible pattern, using a range of means to accommodate this. I'd say that was a good news story. That's something we can build on. Women and men showed markedly different levels of engagement with the Institute, including in membership type, and participation in Institute activities. Women are much less involved in what we could call the public culture of architecture. So, another of the outcomes of our research was the PARA Guides to Equitable Practice, as I mentioned earlier. I'm not going to talk about them except to say that we did quite a lot of research in consultation when we were putting them together about what issues people felt were most important to them, what issues they felt were open to change, and which were less open or least open to change. So this one's quite interesting. Which three of the issues listed below do you think are least open to change? This is kind of the bad news story. The long hours culture, the lack of, or the availability of meaningful part-time work in architecture, and the underrepresentation of women in senior roles. That one was really pretty on a par with a number of others, including gender-based pay equity. But more hopefully, the things that were seen to be most open to change were pay equity. Now that's something that this group might be interested in pursuing. The availability of mentoring, and the underrepresentation of women in public culture. So some things were seen as possible. Other things were seen as very difficult, possibly intractable. So the findings of that process, of the consultation on the Guides to Equitable Practice, were that there's a low incidence of overt discrimination, with the notable exception of staff returning from parental leave and wishing to work part-time. There were some pretty hair-raising instances of explicit discrimination there, which I need not remind you is against the law. There's a strong sense of professional identity in architecture as liberal, meritocratic, dedicated to the common good. Everybody feels that. Everybody feels part of a community, women and men. Women feel respected. They value the community, as we all do. There are powerful processes of enculturation and socialisation in architecture. The resulting tight community is inclusive of women, but for this reason there is wariness about gender distinction. We all know women who do not want to be picked out as a woman architect, and Justine and I and the research team have always been very sympathetic to that position. There is a high level of engagement and investment in equity issues in the profession. There is a lot of goodwill. Both employers and employees are aware of equity issues and willing to work for change. Some cultural issues are perceived to be very hard to shift. Long hours culture and the project-based nature of work, and it's being shackled to the economy are key ones. But other issues are perceived to be more open to change. They are, to use the cliche, low-hanging fruit. Respondents saw the Institute as having an opportunity to play a much greater role in ensuring gender equity in the profession, and so we at the PARA team, the research project, applaud the New South Wales Gender Equity Task Force for putting together this Champions program, which is being observed with great interest around the country, and I think is a model that we may hopefully roll out further. So this is the final slide, and the final thing to say, I guess, is that another of the outcomes of our research project and our partnership with the Institute nationally was a gender equity policy. So the Institute, as you know, now has a national gender equity policy, of which these are the principles, and it also has a national gender equity committee, of which I'm a member, and I'm here as an emissary of that committee to support this event and to support the program that the New South Wales Gender Equity Task Force is putting together. We see it as a possible pilot, which hopefully, possibly, could be rolled out across the other states. But as a kind of anecdote in closing, that national committee has met several times and has been having very intensive discussions about what could be done at the national level to further the cause. and we're reviewing a number of the Institute's practices and policies across a range of areas, CPD, the awards policy, prizes policy. And in the course of talking about the awards, which was a conversation I was directly involved with, there was talk about rewarding leadership in gender equity in architecture, rewarding the women, those exceptional women who do manage to make it through the obstacle course, and of course we must recognise and celebrate and encourage those women. But I guess my position has always been that we also want to recognise, celebrate and encourage the people who remove the obstacles from the obstacle course so that more women can get through. You'll know the expression, the rising tide lifts all boats. And I think what we're seeing here, hopefully, is a rising tide. And it's the male champions of change, other men and other women working in solidarity who remove the obstacles that do exist for women in architecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi. That was fascinating and frightening. Let me introduce Elizabeth Broderick. I'm sure she needs no introduction, but let me tell you a little bit about her. The Sex Discrimination Commissioner Elizabeth is the Sex Discrimination Commissioner for the High Commission, for the Australian Human Rights Commission, and founder of the ASX 500 Males Champions of Change program. Please welcome Elizabeth to the stage.
Thanks very much, Sean, and it's such a great pleasure to actually have made it here. Sorry, there was a bit of change on the dates, and I really apologise for that. But we've been in the United Nations looking at the progress on women's rights over the last 20 years since what they call the Beijing Platform for Action, which was the big women's conference that happened in Beijing 20 years ago. And I have to say, unfortunately, it is a bit of a mixed picture. But it's terrific to be here today, and I do want to congratulate Sean. It's your first day on the job, and boy, you're doing a good job so far. Also to Naomi, what a great presentation, and to have that level of evidence for change. It's just so important, because I see so many initiatives get derailed because the evidence base isn't there, and that's one of the great gifts now, I think, to the architecture industry in this nation, is that we have strong and compelling evidence about why change is necessary. And to Kalantha and all the others, to Jess, congratulations on the work that you've done and the fact that you've made the issue of gender equality of women's leadership such an issue in the industry. So, as Sean was saying, I'm Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. I've been the Commissioner now for about 7 years. I remember when I came home to tell my young son, Tom, guess what, Tom? Mum's going to be Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. He was about 12. His jaw just dropped. He looked at me and said, Mum, that is so gross, he said. He's now 19. He thinks it's pretty cool. He gets pull a few women in with it. My daughter's not so happy. I spoke at her her school asked me could I go and speak at the International Women's Day event they were having. This was last year actually. And she came racing home from school. She said, Mum, my friends say you're coming to speak at our International Women's Day event. And I said, yeah, remember Lucy, we talked about that. She said, you are such an embarrassment. Can't you work on the tuck shop like all the others? So I do have another job, and that's embarrassing my children. But I have to say, this role is such a privilege. I mean, one day I might be 200 metres under the ocean in a submarine. I do a lot of work with the military, or just as I was up until yesterday in the United Nations in New York, and I have to say I met with Hillary Clinton. That was pretty special. To camping out with Aboriginal women in Northern Australia, to the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan, into Oregon Province, the White House, the Pentagon, NATO, the World Bank, and you can be in that order all in a couple of months. So there are really no roles like this. And I think the tremendous privilege of this role is whether I'm working with profession professionals like you in the room today, whether I'm working with refugees or to support Defence Force personnel, women with disability, Indigenous women, every day I get to work with individuals who care about change, who are using whatever influence they have to create a more equal world. And one of the joys of that, of course, is working with Aboriginal women and men. So I want to start by acknowledging their advocacy on the issue of equality for so many generations, and to also pay my respects to elders past and present, and to recognise that we're meeting today on traditional Aboriginal land. So what I want to do really is to do three things. I want to talk about what the challenge of increasing the representation of women, particularly at senior levels. I want to talk about the importance of leadership, and particularly men stepping up beside women, not speaking for us, not saving us, but stepping up beside us on some of these issues. And also just to finish by suggesting how every one of us in the room today can actually play a part in finding solutions in this area in the architectural industry. So we saw so clearly from Naomi that the data is clear and compelling. The raw data does not lie. The number of studies that have been done also to link performance and optimum outcome shareholder returns with women's representation in individual organisations, in nations, would fill any building that you've ever designed or envisaged. And Sean talked a lot about it. Those organisations which have greater levels of gender diversity, and it doesn't matter whether you're the military or Rice Dorney, it doesn't matter. The fact is the outcomes when you have a greater level of gender diversity are superior. There's good research on that now. In fact, I'll just show you, they're just looking at some of the research that's out there. So that's why I think it's terrific that you've got PALA, you've got the Gender Equity Task Force, you've got the evidence base from which to actually start to take action. And Naomi said, well, maybe we in the architecture profession, we're a bit different to everyone else. I can tell you the list of issues and everything I saw up there is no different to any other organisation I work with, whether that's McKinsey, whether it's the military, whether it's the Commonwealth Bank or ANZ, whether it's women in STEM. These issues are pretty much identical. The bottom line is the higher up you go, the less women you'll see. That's as true as gravity and taxes. Doesn't matter what industry I'm looking at. So if the data's so compelling, why aren't we seeing the progress? And I think in many places there's been good work done to remove what I call overt or formal discrimination, and that would be the case in the architecture profession. But what is left is really a form of indirect discrimination. It's practices and systems that on their face look neutral, such as the career development systems, but they actually reproduce disadvantage for one particular group. And that data showed what group that is, and that's women. And I'd posit that it's largely women with caring responsibilities. So I call this indirect discrimination, I call it gender asbestos. It's hard to identify, it's hard to combat, but it's built into the walls, the floors, the practices, the structures, the behaviours of organisations and institutions and organisations like the ones you inhabit. There is no one policy that will eliminate gender asbestos, and like the impact of asbestos on humans, over time it may become terminal. So if you take really nothing else away from my talk today, I want you to take this, and that is that if we don't actively and intentionally include women, the system will unintentionally exclude them. And the reason for that is, as I think Sean or someone put up on this slide earlier on, as Gordon Cairn said, men invented the system, men largely run the system, men need to change the system. So it doesn't matter which organisation we're looking at, whether it's the military or indeed one of your organisations, the history of the organisation is deeply rooted in a male norm. Unless we actively and intentionally set out to include women, we will unintentionally exclude them. So what's the solution to that? The cure, I think, is courageous leadership. Because the reality is that in most organisations, the business case for gender diversity is quite well understood intellectually. People get the link between diversity and superior performance. But despite this, and despite so many programs, mentoring programs, women's networking programs, assertiveness training, this and that, despite all those programs, we see little change in outcomes. So why is that? And I think there's two reasons. The first reason is that while we've embraced the case for change at a cognitive level, we haven't embraced it at an emotional level. And by that I mean our gender schema, which is a deeply held belief system that we have about the role of men and women in society and the world, about who cares and who works, the thoughts that we really internalise from the minute we put our feet on the ground. We looked around, what's mum doing, what's dad doing, who has power, who doesn't, who's working, who's caring. All those things helped us develop a deeply held belief system about gender, and the fact is that that belief system clashes with the case for change. Because the case for change is a model where leadership and power is shared between men and women. So that clash makes it very difficult for us to accept this new world. That's the first reason. I think the second reason some of these initiatives fail is they focus entirely on engaging and changing women. What I call the fixing women model. We look at women from a deficit model. If we could just make them more like men, if we could just make them fit into the ideal worker model, and we saw some great data on the number of hours that architects are working. Too many organisations look to women alone to change the status quo. And when you think about that, that is such an illogical approach. Because the fact is that women don't have the levers of power in their hands. We saw it. How many women are partners? How many women are professors? How many women are directors? Those are the roles that are powerful. And women are really underrepresented in that area. So if you look at where power resides in the profession, it resides in the hands of men. So over the last 7 years, since I've been in this role, I've become more and more convinced of one thing. And that's my second theme. And that is, if we want to deliver equality for women, we actually have to focus on men. We need men taking the message of gender equality to other men. That's what's going to shift the picture. And as I said, it's not about men speaking for us or saving us. It's about men stepping up beside women so that promoting women's leadership becomes all our business. This is not a women's issue. This is an economic and societal issue. And having come to that realisation about 3 years ago now, I established what we call the Male Champions of Change strategy. It's a strategy to engage powerful, decent men in change. And it's so great to see the profession step up with 8, soon to be 10, male champions to really start taking this message out to other men within the architecture profession. How did it begin? Well, basically I figured, well, if we need the most powerful and decent men, I better pick up the phone and ring them. So I rang men who lead our iconic companies, and you can see many of them there. Men who lead Telstra, the Commonwealth Bank, Qantas, Woolworths, men who lead global organisations like Citibank, like Goldman Sachs, like Deloitte, men who hold the most senior roles in government, like the head of a treasury, the head of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And then indeed I brought in David Morrison, you can see him there, Lieutenant General David Morrison, the Chief of Army, who's been a fabulous champion of change. And I made a personal plea. I said to each of these men, I said, will you use your power and influence, your collective voice and wisdom to create change for women in this nation? And that's really the same approach that Kalantha and Sean have taken to bring us 10 really good men who are prepared to step up on this in the architecture profession. So I remember our first get together with the men. It was a room full of A-type personalities and me. But we came together to really take ownership and to commit to the difficult decisions that needed to be taken. So the discussions are serious. There, as you can see, some of the photos in action here. They're led by men, and action is taken. And I think the most powerful thing about the Male Champions of Change strategy is it's a safe space for men to learn about gender. Because this is a really nuanced debate. You can see, I see really great, well-intentioned men, particularly when they're out in the media, they'll say something and then the sisterhood dumps on them from a big height. So this is about helping men learn about the language of gender and the complexity of it, because it's a hugely complex issue. As these men say, it's the most complex issue they deal with as CEOs of their organisations. But they use an approach which really has 3 stages, which is listening, learning, and then leading with action. So they listen deeply to the voices of women. And Naomi talked about some of the heartbreaking stories of women, particularly around pregnancy discrimination and other areas. I hear those every day. And one of the first things these men did was to get out and hear the stories. What we need to do is take the case for change from the head to the heart. And that's why the storytelling is very, very important. So they listen to the voices of women, to gender experts. They develop a deep understanding of gender equality. And then from their listening and learning, they step up and take practical action. And in fact, the first practical action our men took was they wrote to every business leader in this nation, urging them to get on board. And indeed, every year they've put out a new report. But what I found is that individual men become more bold in the collective, and part of that is the competition that exists. And that's fantastic, I'm loving that. So, and I want to give you one example of that. They work together on what they call their All Roles Flex initiative. So rather than a female or a male employee having to ask for and justify a flexible work arrangement, many of these CEOs have said, right, from now on, every role in our organisation is available as in a flexible work arrangement. They're changing the starting point of work away from the ideal worker model to flexibility as the starting point. Where someone considers that this isn't possible, it's up to the manager to justify why the job or that particular role can't be done that way. So it is bold, it's innovative, and it's delivering. Telstra have had it rolled out for maybe 9 or 10 months now. ANZ are just rolling it out, the ASX. It's really changing the starting point of work. They've really gone beyond the market in terms of their gender metrics. So what they report on the number of women at CEO -1, -2, -3, -4 level, as well as a lot of reporting around pregnancy discrimination and a whole range of things, including the gender pay gap. They've done simple things like they adopted the panel pledge. So these men now, they won't speak at any event where there's not a good representation of women speaking. And it's a small step, but between them they worked out, they speak at 1,000 events a year, from security to aviation to technology, and if they can help lift several thousand women by saying, look, sorry, we can't deliver the keynote address at your conference because you don't have enough women on the panel, that can be transformative. And in fact, I can't tell you the number of calls I get from conference organisers around the world saying your Male Champion's just about to pull out of his keynote address, where are these women? And in the last 12 months, really, despite being some of the busiest men in the country, they've spoken at well over 75 women's leadership events. They travelled to Washington, New York, Tokyo, Brazil, other nations for me to actually step it up and talk to other men about the importance of gender equality. The other thing they're doing is they're looking down their supply chain. They've worked out between them, they have, tens and tens of billions of procurement dollars. They want to spend it with organisations that care about gender equality just like them. So your group joins a thriving community of practice, which includes now well over 100 of Australia's most influential and powerful men. And while we hope you may learn something from our mistakes, and I have to say we've made a lot, we also know that you'll benefit from the learnings that we've had over the last 4 years. So I promised, they're just some of the groups that we've got happening. The one that I'm quite excited about is Elite Sport, Male Champions of Change Elite Sport. There will be the 20th most powerful men in men's sport. and we kicked it off with a lot of the AFL CEO clubs and rugby and cricket and swimming and basketball and whatever 2 months ago now. And I think the potential to build a more inclusive nation, a more equal nation through sport, which is the language of our nation, is a really inspiring thing. So we'll watch that space. I promise now that I just end with some practical actions and really to urge you today to really step up on this issue, because in the discussions in the United Nations, as I have been the last few days, the real question is, is it right that we would put 50% of the world's talent, creativity, best minds to one side purely on the basis of gender? Because that's what you're doing when you don't actually fix the data that we see up before us. What do you need to do? Well, what the men do, they're not male champions of change necessarily because of their achievements. They're male champions of change because they want to lead tangible action to create change. I mean, the Chief of Army is a great example of that. He only has 12% of his army who are women. So when he came to me, there would be a view that, well, maybe he's not at a level in terms of women's engagement that he would come into the male champions. But I have to say he's been one of the most powerful, and that is because he's such a courageous leader on these issues. Women are being promoted now at twice the rate of their representation. He's recruited more women into the army in the last year than the previous decade. He's stepping up and really leading tangible action. So the things that you can do is to really ask your team for feedback. If you could do one thing after tonight, it would be to get out and listen to the stories. Every woman in your organisation will have a story. She may have a story about the expectation she had for her career and where it's actually gone. She may have a story about exclusion. She may have a story about pregnancy discrimination or indeed sexual harassment. Make it your business to get out and listen to the stories. As our men's, that's where they started. And not only that, they looked at their own leadership. They said, I'm going to look at 4 things: what I say, what I do, what I prioritise, and what I measure. I say I care about gender equality, but I arrange the meetings at 7:30 a.m. They really looked at where there was a disconnect between the leadership they thought they were providing on this issue and the leadership they were actually providing. So I think in the short time that we've had together, I hope I've been able to give you a sense of how leaders just like you are actually stepping up on this issue, and that I've inspired you to go out and do likewise. But I think the most important thing is that human rights starts at home. The change starts with us. And it seems fitting tonight, as I leave, if I just could kick off with a video from our founding group of male champions, so don't take it from me. Hear the men's views on why it is that women's leadership and a more gender equal Australia matters. Thanks very much. In Australia today, we still don't have full gender equality. Only 19% of board positions are held by women, only 3% of CEO positions, and for every dollar a man earns, a woman only earns 82 cents. It's just not good enough. We all need to do something about it.
This is a societal issue. It's for men and women. But what we're trying to do is, because men lead so many of the big organisations in Australia at the moment, have men who are at the head of those organisations stand up and be counted.
The Male Champions of Change is a group of 25 of Australia's most powerful men. They're doing great work in their own organisation, which is really significant. But not only that, they're taking the message of gender equality to our nation and the world.
There are lots of groups advancing gender equity and female leadership, and nothing like the Male Champions of Change, where 25 chief executives are prepared to stand in front of their peers and be accountable for advancing women leadership in their organisations.
Whether we like it or not, today most of the powerful positions in business are held by men. So if we want to make a difference, the men have to step up. And I think the Male Champions have decided to stand right next to the women they're trying to bring into leadership positions to make that difference.
We're all incredibly different organisations, a bank, a defence force, a public service, but we all realise that Australia is making such poor use of all the talent and potential in 51% of the population, women.
This is the first time a group of senior male leaders in Australia have ever stepped up.
These meetings are not about just talking generally and walking away and then coming back 2 or 3 months later. What it is about is challenging ourselves to make a real difference in our own organisations and in the business community more generally.
In our meetings, we have a lot of, business partners, but also rivals and competitors. But we all park that at the door.
We all experience different roadblocks, different complexities in our business, and having the CEOs explain how they've overcome them, give you support and knowledge about how you can do that in your organisation is something money can't buy.
This makes perfect sense for our organisations and, as an extension, also our economy. But most importantly, the legacy of this is the creation of a more equal world for both our sons and our daughters.
From the very first moment that I was involved in the MCC, I was absolutely certain that I was with a group of men who wanted to make a difference. And nothing, no meeting that has been held since, nothing has changed my mind on it.
From my background, being a gay Irishman that runs one of the iconic companies in the country, university was really important to me. And each of those CEOs in there, I can see the same passion and focus on this diversity, and I think that's really good.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was really inspiring. It's also good to know that we've got a name for the ailment now of gender inequity, and it's a good one for the building industry, gender asbestos. Yeah. A few more things that I just wrote down. Diversity equals superior performance. That was an important takeout. Something that we talk about a bit, we have to emotionally embrace the change, not just intellectually. We also have to take the case for change from the head to the heart. That sounded like wise advice. And flexibility is the starting point. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker tonight is Peter Bailey, the CEO of Arup Australasia. Some of you here might have met Peter before. Peter is also a member of Consult Australia's Champion of Change program. Please welcome Peter to the stage.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. It's a great privilege to have the opportunity to come and address you. I think after the previous two speakers, Elizabeth and Naomi, I don't think I really need to say anything. I think it's the case is closed and it's all very clear. But look, I stand up here as not just the CEO of Arup, but also a champion of change with Consult Australia. And I've been asked to sort of explain to why did I get involved? Why does this matter? For me, this is, and I should say, as an engineer, I'm not really have the right to stand here and tell you how to do things or what's right or what's wrong. The engineering profession has its own set of challenges. The statistics Naomi put up were very familiar to me. The only difference was our pipeline is a whole lot smaller. I mean, only 15% of graduates are female in engineering. So we have a real pipeline problem. But we have the same drop-off and we have the same issues to address. So I don't think it's tenable that only 10% of engineers in this country are women and that only 20% of registered architects are women. That's just not acceptable to me. And how did that become personal for me? Well, it started back in the 90s for me because my wife is an architect. And she came back from overseas with myself after working with some fairly illustrious companies overseas, and at the point at which we were starting to want to raise a family, we couldn't, or she couldn't find a job that would accept part-time working, despite her incredible CV. So she was lost to the profession and subsequently became a project manager and a client to many architects and some in the room here tonight. But that was a wake-up call for me because I come from a very male-dominated engineering background. As you saw, the engineering numbers at university are very low. I kind of accepted that as the status quo. But when I looked at this problem, where my wife was having this challenging environment of trying to get a job, I sort of was looking for people to blame. And I thought, you know, what's the architecture profession up to here? You know, it's not accepting the talent into the room. But when I looked at it, the engineering profession was no different. And actually, when I looked even harder, I actually realised the problem was me. That it was me, you know, I was the cause of this blame, both in the sense of being myself, in my role as a partner, in my role as a husband, in my role as a man, and also people like me, other men like me in our professions, really just weren't awake to this challenge that was facing women in the profession of architecture and engineering. So that was a wake-up call for me, and ever since that point, I've really attempted to learn more about this issue and to gradually become an advocate for gender equity in our professions. I don't think it's acceptable that we're bleeding bright young female talent out of these professions. It's just not acceptable. It's not good for the country. We need that talent to be available to us, and it's up to us to design jobs and job environments and career paths that can accommodate different types of people. And of course, we can include all types of diversity in that discussion. But I've decided that I want to change this. So I've decided to stand up. I want to be there beside women trying to make a change. And that's why I joined the Consult Australia Champions of Change. Why should men be the ones that engage in this issue? Of course, we're in that together, but you know, the reality is, as Elizabeth said, most leaders today are men, and the change won't happen unless we step up, unless we personally step up. And until most people in areas of responsibility are women, that's going to be our challenge. And I hope we get to that point. I hope we get to the point where we don't have to have male champions for change, because we have an equitable distribution of leadership across all business. For far too long, as Elizabeth said, we've left this up to the women. We've said, look, this is a women's problem, you go and deal with it. And if there's a problem with the women, let's fix the women and it'll all be solved. I totally believe that's where we've been. There's been too much incumbent male leadership bias in our journey today. It's been very evident in my profession, in my company, in the universities I've been associated with, and the architecture profession generally is the same. It's not hard to argue the business case for diversity. I can't tell you the transformation that's happened in Arup as it's become more and more diverse. We are on a journey. We're nowhere near where we want to be now, or where we want to get to, but the transformation in the innovation, the decision making, the creativity, its ability to reflect society and come up with problems that solve the problems of society, that would not have been possible with an all-male company, and it pretty much started that way. So we've gradually diversified, and we are a much better company, Arup, and a much more successful company because of that diversity. The nice thing I like about all of this is that in addressing some of these issues, actually all staff benefit. You know, men sometimes wash their hands and say, okay, well, you know, go and sort out the women, that'll be okay. But actually, some of these journeys we're going on where we're improving the working conditions, we're adapting to different types of careers, we're adapting to different types of job descriptions, that benefits all of us. I want to work flexibly. I have kids at school. I want to pick up the kids from school. I want to be around for my kids' birthdays. I don't want to work ridiculous hours. These are issues that matter to all of us. So that's why I've got involved. And that's why I think men have to engage in this issue. The program itself has been interesting. It's been great to actually sit around a table with a bunch of competitors, actually. And we're a fiercely competitive bunch in the engineering field. We always undercut each other's fees and do all sorts of silly things like that. I'm sure that doesn't happen in the architectural profession at all. But it's nice to have a common problem to address and to try and work together to solve, and to reflect on all the challenges, the learnings, the failures, the successes that we can share with each other. And I find that really enriching and greatly beneficial, because none of us are there yet. None of us have reached the end of our journey and are saying we've made it. And all of us are on different stages of the journey, from the very, very new to the topic, who are just taking a step into the unknown, to those that have been on this journey for some time. and it's great to have that difference. But the competitive pressure and the pressure on those firms that aren't involved is starting to build. And it's really noticeable. We've got a couple of absences in our champions from very large engineering firms. You should see the pressure that's building on them to get involved. And all the excuses about I'm too busy is changing rapidly. So that's something that's really a benefit of the champions. So we are spreading this throughout the profession through our involvement in this program. It's really very much a chance to be an advocate and a public advocate, because it gives you a status to go out there and talk about that. It doesn't give you a status to say you've got it all solved, but it gives you the status to say that I am working on this and I'm going to stand for this. And it does open doors to engage with other companies, other industries and the media. There are many challenges. We've got a lot of work to do. This is a long-term journey. Sometimes it's really hard to see the discernible difference, the difference that you're making. Sometimes the differences are minute, but we take every success. And we have to deal with the skeptics in our company. There are skeptics in my company, there are skeptics in other companies. There are always going to be people who say, what is the problem? We've got to deal with that bias in that incumbent leadership, and we're working hard on that. One of the benefits is I believe the companies that address this will attract the best talent. There is no question about that. People want to be in a very collaborative, inclusive community. That's what people want. They want to be able to be themselves at work, and they want to be part of a creative, inclusive community. And I believe if you tackle these problems head on, we are going to create better companies. The nice thing is we've agreed now as champions to intervene and disrupt together. So we can't hide. We're talking about this in a safe environment, and we've agreed to intervene into remuneration discussions, recruitment discussions, career paths, how you assign projects in our organisations. Do you always give the best projects to that male over there, and the female gets the leftovers? To tackle the problem at the source of the bias. That's what we're about. My goal is to run a company where I can truly say we've provided equal opportunity to all. I hope that collectively together we might find equity if we allow for difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. It's good to hear your story. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to announce to you tonight the 8 champions that we have on board. We're talking to another 3 other firms, so hopefully we round out our 10 pretty soon. So we'll do that, and then we'll sit around and we'll invite the speakers to a round table, and I'm sure you've got, after that information, some questions you'd like to throw to the panel. So we'll introduce the Institute's Champions of Change. Is there a slide that's going up there, Mr. Slide Man?
That's me.
Alpha male writer.
Yeah. All right, so our Institute's Champions of Change. Ray Brown from Architectus. Troy Ullman from PTW. Adam Haddow from SJB. Phil Dowser from BVN. Philip Vivian, Bates Smart. Our immediate past president, Joe Aegis Cox. Jared Corcoran, Hassel. And Gary Powell, Woods Bagot. So watch this space. I'm sure you're going to hear more about our champions. All right, I'd like to invite the speakers to the table and to ask questions. While they're taking their seats, I just want to acknowledge the event sponsors tonight. And again, you'll start to see a repetition. I'm reading the same names, but sponsors for this talk are BVN, Bates Smart, wonderful institutions like UTS and UNSW, Cox, Hassel, AWS and Bespoke. So we'd like to thank them.
Also, we're just inviting Justine Clark to join us to the panel. Justine is the editor of Parlour Women, Equity and Architecture, which you've all just heard about. I'm sure you're all aware of it. And was also a senior researcher with Naomi on the ARC research project team. So thanks for joining us, Justine. And maybe we can start off with you, if you would like, to just talk about, have a bit of it for Elizabeth and Peter in particular, just to have a bit of discussion around Parlour, your approach, what you've heard tonight.
Well, I think, we set up Parlour for a number of reasons. As Naomi said, it kind of, as our colleague Karen described it, became horribly successful. Much more, it kind of took off much more quickly than any of us imagined. And we set it up for a number of reasons, but one of them was that we knew that there had been many reports, many of them sponsored by the Institute on Women in Architecture over the years, since the 80s, all of which had similar findings, all of which made fantastic recommendations, none of which had any longevity, none of which got any traction. So we thought if we were putting in all this work, we were ourselves trying to get the Institute to set up a policy, that we wanted to ensure that it might have some chance of succeeding. And I guess we thought to do that we really needed to get the architectural community on board, and so to get kind of pressure from the profession as well as from us as a group of academics plus one editor. And that's worked incredibly well, and I think that the take-up of the readership figures that we've got from Parlour, the profile that we've achieved, really just shows the degree to which it was a very pressing issue for many, many people, but there hadn't for some years been a collective place to discuss that. And we set it up with all the advantages of an online environment, which last time feminism and gender were hot topics in architecture was the early 90s. We didn't have that ability to build those communities in an online environment, so I think that was really significant. And we've been very fortunate, I think, also that we probably unwittingly and Naomi set this research project up at a time when no one was talking about gender in architecture. No one was campaigning for Denise Scott Brown to be equal on the Pritzker. We came along at just the right moment. We set up Parlour ahead of many of other international examples, some of whom seem to have followed quite closely in our footsteps, which I think we take as flattery. So we've been quite fortunate, but in many ways, and I think also the presence of an evidence base. It wasn't just, was Parlour is very much an outcome of a very strong research base, and I knew how to edit. So I think that was a lucky combination, really. This initiative, the GET project and this particular initiative just seems incredibly exciting because we wanted the profession to stand up and do something, and that's exactly what's happening. And it's really great that it's not just me and Karen going, we have a broader community of kind of commitment and interest. So Parlour's keeping on going, but we're very, very excited that there are now other groups with whom who are taking it on, who can collaborate with us. Congratulations.
So we'll throw it open for questions, but I might start off by asking a question, and I might ask you, Elizabeth. So with the data that you've seen, how is architecture different or the same in the long hours culture?
It's very much the same as many other professional services firms that I see. So I work with McKinsey, Deloitte, KPMG, a lot of the law firms and whatever, and
I think it came, originally in those industries, it came very much from a time billing model. So time billing means that women or people with caring responsibilities are disadvantaged. And also there was one model of success, and I imagine it's the same, well that data tells me it's the same in the architecture industry as well, that it's the model of success is what we call the ideal worker model, someone who's available 24/7, no visible caring responsibilities, and as a result of that, likely male. That's the face of success in many professional service organisations. So that just off the get-go doesn't work for women. It's never worked for women. I'd argue it doesn't work for a lot of men, and Peter, you talked to that issue, that a lot of men want to be more involved in care. So that's what has to change, and actually it's really about job redesign at some level as well. And it is about, these are hard decisions, but one of the things I say about the architecture profession is your organisations, you control how they run, the business model. It's not like you're a big publicly listed company like ANZ or CBA. If you decided to change tomorrow, you actually could do that. And just to give you one example of what ANZ did last week, the CEO of ANZ, Mike Smith, is one of the male champions. Because of the competitive paradigm we're seeing, I was copied in when I was overseas, but he basically sent out a note on Friday and said, as from Monday, every job in this organisation is available in a flexible work arrangement for whatever reason. And don't argue with me, that's the way it is. And that's what powerful men can do. So no one knows how it's going to work, but everyone's kind of got on board and everyone's running with their request for flexibility. I mean, David Thodey had done it, as I said, several months before at Telstra. What he found was it wasn't just women that were accessing flexible work, it's a lot of men as well. And one thing we know from the research is it's men working differently that will change the culture. No number of women with young children will ever change organisational culture. It'll just be seen as a kind of mummy track for women. So we need our most powerful, our most influential men stepping up and working differently. That's what's going to create change.
I ran an event in Melbourne a while ago where I had Noreen Young, who was then the CEO of the Diversity Council, speak, and then a panel discussion followed by architects, followed the group of architects, successful fabulous architects following. And she left afterwards and went, do architects think they're the only people with deadlines? Yes, we have project-based work. Yes, it's very deadline-driven. It's not as if that's actually that unusual. Like project-based work is not.
Or law firms, professional services.
I think that's one of the big takeouts of tonight, is we're no different.
You're no different. And indeed, almost
just charge
the military as well. I mean, the military always said they're different. And look, yeah, they are the only organisation that's authorised to use lethal force. So I get that's one difference. It's all the same.
Just there, I was going to raise it. I think the architecture profession, one, is hugely undervalued by society, and two, you undervalue yourselves. You know, you're selling your time too cheaply. You know, if we could all get, better remuneration for hours worked, you might have to work less hours, so I think some of those issues, there's all these issues floating around, but I think, of all the professions, a debate about that would be useful with architects, I think, to address that, It's underpaid for the value it brings, I'm in awe of what the architecture profession does for our society, and yet it's not highly paid. So
putting in fee bids that rely on your staff with large numbers of unpaid or large amounts of unpaid time is just completely unethical. And it's the destruction of the profession. I mean, it's like the profession is eating itself. So you kind of, the undervaluing is and the rapacious fee cutting, which is illegal, and I think one of the things we've tried to do, particularly with Transform, is to tie the issues around gender equity to bigger and really pressing issues about the future of the profession.
Yeah, I was just going to say that if there is something that distinguishes architecture, maybe, I think it possibly lies in the skills that architects have. I mean, architects it's a design profession. Architects are about lateral thinking and problem solving. And, if only we would turn our design, very considerable creativity and design skills back on our own work and redesign the profession, maybe that's where actually the uniqueness does lie, and we are in a unique position that perhaps the Army isn't. It really could be doing some good work there, if only we were being as creative with our own work practices as
working out how difficult it is.
And respecting people's time and labour, including your own.
So, any questions?
I have a question for the panel. It's kind of along the similar theme, in fact, partly it's already been answered. That there's a perception in the architecture industry that due to the project-based nature of our work, most mid to senior roles are unable to be or have great difficulty in being undertaken under a flexible or part-time arrangement. The dialogue goes something like, lawyers are different, they can just take on less briefs, their work is less team-based, their clients have different expectations, project deadlines are less punishing, and project leader needs to be available 5 days a week. I'm sure everyone in this room has heard all those arguments for not being that work flexible. I, however, suspect, and I think most of the panel have refuted this, that the issues we face as a profession are less unique than we think. In your experience, are these barriers to flexibility and part-time working into architecture? I think the answer is no. If not, can you comment on how other industries have approached evolving their work practices to better suit flexible working?
I mean, maybe we need some kind of what we call more revolutionary type of approaches like the Mike Smith. Just we declare that every job is available in a flexible work arrangement, and then we work that out as it goes along. I mean, that's a courageous leadership, but I would say you're absolutely right. They're not unique to the architecture profession. I absolutely agree. Legal profession works exactly the same way. Having said that, one of the most depressing days I've spent in my 7 years is with the 10 managing partners of the largest law firm. So I wouldn't be recommending that you necessarily take what's happening there. More depressing than going to the safe houses for women's refuges around Australia, I have to say. But, you know, I'm sorry, if the military can fix it, if the Navy, and I work with them on flexible crewing options, so one of the things we know that we have a leaky pipeline of women in the Navy because of seagoing obligations, so the inability to balance your large deployments. You might be away, and depends if you're in a submarine, you could be off for 7 months. And not only that, in the sub, you can only send 120 character familygram every 2 weeks. It makes Twitter look like a good option. If they can work on flexibility, so can the architecture profession. I mean, they do things, really creative things. They're trialing at the minute, fly in, fly out. Because team-based is just absolutely integral in a sub, in a frigate. But we send one crew in for a certain period, then we fly them out, send another one in. They're looking at a whole lot of different simulation on shore-based operations. So, you know, some of the frigates that are out of use being used as training opportunities so that people can live in Sydney and work in that. So, you know, they're really opening it up. It's about thinking differently. I actually think this is a failure of imagination. And you guys are the most imaginative in the Australian population, the most creative, the most innovative. So I challenge you to actually, step it up and see what are the innovative solutions that you can come up with in terms of job redesign, which is to pick up on your point, Naomi.
I think you might find that your clients maybe aren't quite as, backward as you think they might be in terms of being available 70, 80 hours a week. There are certainly clients like that. But if you have the conversation with your clients about availability, it can open a whole new discussion about what is needed in terms of commitment. One of our partners, who was a female partner, had on her business card, I only work Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. Every time she'd give it to a client, conversation, okay, I can respect that, okay, well, I'll try to contact you only on those days. Now, of course, there are emergencies and things like that that go on elsewhere, but we've got to be courageous and have the conversations with our clients as well as ourselves about, reasonable hours and making flexible working work.
So sometimes it opens up things. I mean, when I became editor of Architecture Australia the day before I told them I was pregnant with my first child, which was a little bit of a stressful situation. But, and I'd never had anyone it's not being an architect, but it was a pretty high pressure job. I never had anyone tell me I couldn't do it. And actually, trucking around that little baby to every bloody architecture event in the country seemed to open up conversations rather than shut them down. I just, I think. But I think there's also there are good examples within our profession, and I think one of the things that we're interested in doing with, in one of the, another, next part of the project is finding some of those good examples and how they're, really specific ones. So the guides to equitable practice are kind of, I think they're very important, but they're quite generic. We're interested in finding how different practices do things differently, and what are the, how does it work? Where are the difficulties? Where are the tension points? Something people keep talking to me about is the potential of job sharing. If doctors can do it, why on earth can't architects? You're not saving lives. I don't know anyone, I haven't yet found anyone who's doing it, but people keep raising it as a possibility. So if you know anyone who's doing good job sharing, come and see me. Hassel do. Good. Yeah. Great.
You might be tapped at the door.
What we've also, so if you just say, what we've also learned to do is to say no. Most of the clients. We don't demand any silly stuff. So we talk to them about just saying no. If you were asked to do that in any other walk of life, you'd probably say no, I think that's reasonable. Let's talk about it and find out how we do it. So learning the value of saying no has been a huge step forward because it releases some of the pressure out of projects. We actually get to be more efficient by doing it as well. So one of the big things is just having the right conversation and knowing when to say no and not being frightened to say no. The sky isn't falling.
Not being bullied, not letting yourself be bullied.
So lots of hands there, just...
Thank you, fantastic evening, and I'd just like to, I think Justine threw out I think this is an opportunity. I wonder to what extent we're leaking because we fail to move the frame of our professional lens in a broader way. And I guess I see this as an opportunity to kind of reshape the way we practice architecture. Many of us, me included, have to move away from the sort of traditional lens of practice to actually follow career opportunities or do the things I was really passionate about. So I'll kind of throw this back to the panel, sorry, with my phone. To what extent is this an opportunity for us to reframe the way we practice? The leakiness is that women are finding other ways to practice and influence the many pressing issues that face our society. So I wonder if this is a dual kind of challenge for us as a profession. And Elizabeth, I love the panel challenge, but I'm wondering if you've got a tactic when you walk into a room full of engineers and, the practical tactics that we face as women to kind of do that in a polite and diplomatic way. So I think the panel challenge was a fantastic example where there's two questions.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. It's an opportunity. You're right, and women do contribute in so many ways when they leave architecture organisations. But the fact is, I do think it's still about power. So for many women who'll go and start their own architecture firm, they will have power when they start to build a larger organisation, but they will still face a lot of hurdles that men who are doing something similar won't face. And I think that's what we have to focus on, is dismantling some of those barriers as well. So you're right, it needs to be framed as an opportunity. And not only that, if you do succeed in really ensuring that female talent stays in the industry, firstly, that's going to have a huge positive economic benefits. But secondly, we're going to get a better outcome. We're going to live in an environment where the built environment, the design is superior to anything we've had before. So we're all going to benefit as a part of that as well.
I think what you're pointing to though too is that many people trained as architects, you, me, Naomi, probably other people in this room, work very much within the discipline, but not as, not as architects in the traditional way. And I think that so there are two kinds of leaks. I don't think I've left the profession, but I don't turn up in any statistic. Maybe if I feel, so I think there's that. And then there's the women who feel actively pushed out. And that's a different story. There are really heartbreaking stories around that. Now, some of those women will go sideways, as your wife did. I mean, how could she could be a project manager and not an architect? It's inconceivable. As if somehow it's not like it's any easier. So there's a question about being pushed out, and there's questions about finding other opportunities. And I think the profession I mean, if you look at how, well, you know, to be a member of the Institute and actually sit on a committee, you need to be a registered architect. The profession has all these kinds of gates around itself, which lead to a very, very narrow view of what the profession is, and exclude vast numbers of people who are highly educated in the discipline, highly active and highly committed. I used to get letters from the registration boards constantly. So-and-so has been described as an architect, and you know, they're not registered, no, and it's like, you know, they've been working for 20 years to improve the profession. You know, might be should. So I think this is. I have some questions. For goodness sake.
I agree entirely. I think casting the net wider is a great thing. How do architects contribute in other careers, in other lives, and don't exclude them from the club. You know, it just becomes a very cosy little club. I mean, Arup has 400 architects working for it. You know, I bet you 99% of them aren't actually practicing the strict definition of architecture. We've got them engaged in incredible careers. So I think casting the net wider might actually help.
And it helps reshape an idea of what the profession is and can be. And that's not to, you know, denigrate the people who make great buildings. It's not one or the other. But it is to say that architectural experience, knowledge and education can opportunities to contribute, to do interesting work in a broad range of ways. And if the profession might recognise the many people who are doing that, it would be, I think, a healthier organisation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. Your point that women have been in reinventing practice for quite some time now because they've been forced to, more or less, because otherwise they wouldn't be in the profession at all. So necessity really has been the mother of invention here. And but we've tended to think of those as marginal or fringe or peripheral or somehow alternative careers. But I think if we looked at that as for what the lessons that we could all take from it and the benefits that we could all take, I think you're right. It's in some ways it's right there in front of us.
Up the back there. That's you.
This is a question to you. I'm interested in your ideas about education, not architectural education, but education about implicit gender bias, which we know is unconscious. Research shows that both men and women have a gender bias against women. When you were talking about the champions of change, what was interesting to me is that when you were talking to the men about behaviours such as not having meetings at 7:30 in the morning, and there's a click going on, that there's attitudes and beliefs, and so in order to change behaviour, we have to take a few steps back to look at beliefs. And I mean programs such as implicit association tests or that kind of thing in implementing change.
You're absolutely right on that. I mean, gender stereotyping for both women and men is one of the main barriers to making progress. I mean, I was in an interesting presentation on that in the UN the last couple of days, and the conclusion was that we all see the world in the way we are rather than the way it is. So we're basically looking from our own perspective at it. And when I talk about the gender schema, that's really what I'm talking about, our unconscious beliefs, the deeply held beliefs we have about gender. One of the most, I think, positive, with some of the most positive work that I'm doing at the minute is to build gender equality principles into the national school curriculum. So that's from age 5 onwards. So when you come into school now, gender equality is built into a lot of the picture books, a lot of learning from there on. It's mainstream, so it's not hanging off in a separate subject that you need to do in secondary school. It's built into the maths curriculum. You'll be looking at the gender pay gap. It's built into the science curriculum, into English, into history, following the women's movement, whatever. So there's a lot more content now which is being built into the school curriculum, and that will start to deliver, I think, into the future. The question is, what do we do with all of us who are legacy? And I think, there was a presentation on the Harvard Implicit Association, and we were a group of incredibly engaged women's activists from around the world, and even we had, because we did it as an exercise, even we had a slight bias in many ways, against women. So you're right. We have to make our bias explicit, we have to own it, and then we have to correct for it in the decisions that we make.
this is a kind of a trivial aside, but and in fact it may be apocryphal. I don't know whether it's true, but I remember reading on the social medias some time ago that people take hurricanes less seriously if they're given female names.
All right, in the middle there.
Hi. I was just wondering, as a rule of thumb, how long do initiatives like this take before you can begin to see some change? Because I think that's the thing. It's fantastic. It's a launch of this tonight, but there's going to be a period where there's going to be review, and there's going to be are there going to be some targets? How do we actually really effectively assess that we're actually seeing some change and that we're building change together? It's an open question for, I don't know if Eric's done it or Elizabeth
comment,
you.
but I think it's for the champions to also speak to that question, because one of the great things about the group that's launching tonight is that it will launch on the back of 4 years of learning about what are effective interventions and what are not effective interventions. So I think you'll really get a head start on than when we were starting off more generally. But if I can just tell you, with some of the systemic interventions that you might decide to put in place, and if I look at the one, because you saw the CEO of the Stock Exchange is one of our male champions, really what we've seen in the last 3 years is a doubling of the number of women on boards. It's jumped from 8% to nearly 20%. That's off the back of a situation where in the previous decade we've gone up 0.2%. So that's a really positive story. It's an intervention that the male champions and others put into the ASX. You won't have such systemic interventions necessarily, but if you act collectively in your organisations, you could see change reasonably quickly. I don't know, it's up for you guys to answer that.
Can I contribute to that? Some research, I think 2014 or this year, showed that by educating with implicit bias, if you get 25% of your workers on board, you can have serious action. So not just the motivation, but following through to understanding what implicit bias is, having the motivation to change, and then a huge cultural shift happening. And that doesn't necessarily have to be high level. It was shown to be all throughout the levels of an organisation. So that's what you can do to get change, 25%. Just education.
So that'll be one good intervention, potential intervention for male champions and change organisations. Yeah.
We're going to the back row. Frantic hand.
Thanks. 20 years ago I was teaching at Newcastle University, and through some very proactive direction from the Vice-Chancellor about getting more women on academic senate, I ended up being there. And then I was on women's group trying to work out how to promote more women in that very male-dominated university. And I remember being at one meeting where someone said, well, we shouldn't be having meetings at 7:30 in the morning or 6 p.m. at night, because that actively disincentives, makes it impossible for women. And another woman said, well, that actually isn't true. What you're doing by saying that is saying that the men who are equal parents are abdicated from their responsibility for taking over those roles, and that you should be able to sort of enable women to go to those meetings. I found it a really challenging thing, and I don't know what the answer is, but it's a bit like, I think, the thing of saying all jobs should be able to be flexible. Until you say that, and you say that, well, women can go, meetings can be at any time, and not assume that the women are taking on the parenting roles. It's a really big thing. I don't know what the answer is.
You're right on that. Look, the data's clear. 70% of all unpaid work is done by women in this nation. If you've got a child with a disability, 92% of care of children with disabilities is women. Even if you look at parents-in-law, and we're going through the largest ageing of the population, 70% of that care is done by women. So what we're trying to do, I absolutely agree with that woman who said that caring should be everyone's business, men and women. We're right, that's absolutely the truth. The fact is we're fighting against a social norm that if you were educated and born in Australia, you believe that only women make good carers. In fact, you probably believe in the good mother belief. You believe that good mothers are always with their children. Now, they can be gambling, smoking, abusing. It doesn't really matter if your kids are a good mother. So they're the social norms we're trying to dispel, and it is about men and women. If I was only able to do one thing to promote gender equality in Australia, it would be the better sharing of paid and unpaid work between men and women. So that woman's spot on. But until this situation changes, and I can say it hasn't changed in 20 years, we shouldn't have meetings at 7:30. It's not working for us.
Just on the one thing on that reporting, I would think that we would see it as our role as the Gender Equity Task Force to any minuscule gain we get, we'll stand on the rooftops and scream it out to the profession. And I will say one thing, we didn't call it a committee, we called it a task force, because we want to run out of a job. We want the whole gender equity question to be taken off the table. I will go to this hand up the back here, who's been very persistent. Thank you. You.
I know we're talking about male chapters of change tonight, but how important do you think it is for young women to have senior female role models in order for them to, progress in our industry? And after you tell me that, I have a second part to my question.
I mean, you can't be what you can't see. It's as simple as that. If we don't have a critical mass of female role models at partner level, director level, professor level in the profession, what chance do other women have of ever stepping up into those roles? So I think it's absolutely critical. I don't know if you agree.
Agree.
So my second part is that I've heard a rumour that it's very hard for Institute to get mentors in their program they're trying to launch. Now, you have to be registered and a member of the Institute to be a mentor. And stats we saw tonight show that there aren't many registered women architects. So you're not going to get many female mentors, which probably isn't very good for the young women in the program.
I think that's also about time. I mean, Victoria's run a constructive mentoring program for some years now, and it's always slightly harder to find mentors than mentees, but I believe that program is very, successful and vibrant, and people actually join the institute so they can be part of it. But, I mean, look, the flip side to the dreary statistics is when I start thinking about, if I want to run a discussion here, I've got screens of fabulous women on my lists. It's not as if it's, so there are many great women in the profession as well, and I think we need to kind of...
Are they connected to women in the profession?
I'm not sure, but
I
think the mentoring is really important.
It is important, but what's even more important is sponsorship. And you don't need other women to sponsor you. Good men can sponsor you. And what we've seen, our male champions don't actually talk much about mentoring because the research shows women are over-mentored and under-sponsored. Mentorship is where I'm talking to you, and it absolutely has a place. I mean, I've had some beautiful mentors over my life. So it has a place, but mentor is where I'm talking to you. Sponsorship is where I'm talking about you in forums that you could never access, and I'm opening up opportunities for you. And I think that's what we need the male champions in architecture to actually do, and that's about connecting with young women as well.
Yeah. I was just going to say, sorry, do you want to go? I was just going to say also you might want to think about cross-profession mentoring. I think there's some real benefits both ways from getting access to senior women from other professions, and a lot of learnings, a lot of benefit there. So I think there should be plenty available. But if you wanted connections to other professions that I can link you to, I'd be very happy to help.
It's more just the point that you must be registered to be a mentor in our program, and yet we're saying there aren't many registered female.
Well, I think the other thing is that the senior registered women are in such high demand for doing everything, and are often trying to juggle complex lives that may or may not include children. So it's about actually just not being.
So why do you have to be registered?
Relax the rules.
You're not better than me. It just appears to me it's a structural barrier that is holding back a lot of good initiatives. Maybe registration is critical for some part, I don't know what that is, but you know, when you hold yourself out to clients as a registered architect, but these other things which are ancillary can open up much more likely than that.
Actually, there's a misunderstanding here because I was just reading the mentor program today, and you don't have to be a registered architect. You just have to be a member of the institution.
But everyone thinks you do, but you don't actually.
All you need is to have substantial post-graduation experience. So I think it's a matter of actually encouraging women to come forward and see their role as mentors, because often they feel time poor and unable to provide that sort of support. But you know, there's a sort of a symbiotic cycle, I suppose. You need to be feeding into the next generation to help them to achieve the things that they need to achieve.
And off the back of that bit of a call to arms, we are struggling to find enough mentors. You come and see me after the show if you want to talk about it. I'm just conscious of time. I know Peter's got to go about now. Maybe we could do one more question.
Zoe?
I've got a question about role desire. It's probably for Peter, but anyone is welcome to step in. Elizabeth talked about listening. And I just wondered if you had any experience you could share with us. There seemed to be this quite big cliff when you turned 30 that things all go wrong. And I suspect it's often associated with taking a break from work for your care and responsibilities. And to me, there's no mystery that you go out, you see more of the world, you're not in the office 11 hours a day, you come back and realise you're not being paid all that much. You don't have any equity, there's not a profit incentive for you. You're the project leader, you've got a lot of the responsibility, not much decision making, and that seems to be when people opt out. And so my question was whether you had any surprises or had any opportunities you could share with us when women are offered this role. You know, you come back to work, well, here, have your role back again. It seems to me that often they say, no thanks. It's not that great.
Look, I've certainly seen that happen, and you know, to some extent, I think my wife was looking at those sides of things as well. It's you know, once you've seen another side to life, then what do you? How do your values change? How do your needs change? How do your interests change? I think it's really important that we recognise those challenges that people are left with and what they're coming back to. And I think it's about the job design and the role design to accommodate the different types of people and different types of needs. The loss to the profession of this going away and not coming back is huge. And I haven't got the answer because it's a very individual thing. It's a very individual preference thing. The main thing I think is to engage in a conversation, to not just cast people out as soon as they don't fit that role that you thought they came out of and they want to go back into. Start the conversation about what's possible. They might be able to find alternatives. There might be different ways to make it work. Certainly, when we've done that, it's worked really well and it's been a successful bond going forward. When the engagement is not there, people really just drop off the side. And that's a great loss to our business, let alone the profession. So I'm not sure if that's answered your question fully enough, but...
I was hoping for more specifics.
There's so many different cases. As I said, every individual is so different, and the old cookie cutter mould that everybody's the same just doesn't seem to work anymore. So.
No, I just add to that, Peter, because I think you're absolutely right on that. But the conversation needs to start back when a woman's talking, when she is pregnant. I completed a national inquiry into pregnancy and return to work discrimination last year. And what I can tell you now, based on a nationally representative sample, is 1 in 2 women in this nation will experience discrimination, either when they tell the boss or the supervisor that they're pregnant, when they go on parental leave, or when they attempt to come back in a flexible work arrangement. And when I looked at why that is, the law is very strong in this area. The fact is it's not being implemented in the culture, and the conversations about this are just not being had. And when I looked at what best practice, those organisations that were doing it really well, when a woman came to talk about her pregnancy, they really engaged in the discussion with her. And they started, as you say, to tailor some kind of response that worked for the business, of course, because if it doesn't work for the business, it'll never work for you, but worked for the business and the individual. Then they kept in contact with her across the parental leave period. Because for a lot of women, the heartbreaking stories that I heard when they were kind of felt that they'd been tossed out, having spent 15 years in the organisation, they never heard anything during parental leave. So just working out what level of contact she wants. And then when she comes back in, it's not, oh, so you're back again. It's, actually we've got a plan. We've buddied you up with someone who's a bit, more senior than you, who's actually been through pregnancy and return to work just like you. So that, there's really quite a deal of hand-holding, and that really led to the best outcomes.
Yeah.
But it is a major reason that women leave the labour market entirely. 22% of those women who did experience discrimination packed up their bags and left the labour market entirely, and that's the issue that we're trying to address.
I think that's one area that we were doing particularly badly in the past when we were having maternity leave. We were just, okay, see you, come back in.
You're going on holiday.
Yeah.
Well, have a nice holiday.
And I understand some people don't want to be in contact, but we made the contact available, and I think the more we made an effort on that front, and we invite them into social afternoons, or make sure they've still got the email address working, and the newsletters still go to them, and phone calls every now and then, and making sure there's some people making contact. We found a huge benefit from that. It just made that return to work that much easier and much smoother. But we certainly weren't doing that well before, and the difference is huge.
And if you're looking for practical tips on that, I happen to know that exact issue is covered in the Parlour Guide to Equitable Practice called Career Breaks.
I think the other thing is that actually practices often don't consider themselves as businesses, and they often don't think about the long-term issues. So, staff turnover is a substantial cost, which I think is often not even really thought about. Some practices do, some don't, but so the kind of short-term pain of having someone working part-time flexibly, for a couple of years is seen as so difficult that it's sort of not worth, but actually the long-term gain of having that person active in the practice, that knowledge, that talent, is substantial. But I think so many, not all, but so many architectural practices don't think in the sort of long-term business sense. It's really quite important.
And sorry, if I could just add, they're largely not listed, so there's no imperative that it's a closed door decision.
Just going to check in, ask one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
In Malik's 2013 discussion paper, What Women 1.3 Construction, posed the comment, the biggest barrier to implementing change is the resistance to change itself. But then went on to recommend that change would require commitment from the top down and the bottom up. The Champions of Change program is an attempt to address the top down. I'm keen to see more women progress through the leaky pipeline into leadership roles. What are some strategies, practical strategies, that can be implemented to detach women from the sticky floor?
Actually, what you suppose, because you make a very good point, it is about top down and bottom up, but where most change stops is in the middle. Because what we have in the middle of any organisation, be it an architecture firm or any other, is what I call the keepers of a culture. They're the people who've been there for quite a while, they've been doing it the same way day in, day out, and what you're suggesting that it can be done a bit differently, that we're changing the goalposts. So if the keepers of a culture, middle management, that middle layer, are not engaged in the change process, then it actually won't. We know it won't deliver, even if the top actually wants it to deliver. So that, in a nutshell, is the program of work for the Male Champions of Change group this year. What are the 10 tangible actions which will shift in the middle that can be taken? So, definitely watch this space. We'll ensure that these types of initiatives and the work that's going on in the founding group is actually fed in to the architecture group because we want to take, we will come up with a list of practical actions men can take to really get the change through the middle management layer. But, you know, I mean, we can probably give you 10 things anyway. But most of which shouldn't be on focusing on fixing women, they should be focused on changing the system. So for example, this issue around registration, you know, some of the structural barriers, you should really basically decouple the career continuum, unbundle it, look at where the points in the career continuum, where they reproduce disadvantage for women, and get rid of those things. Do it differently. Ask the question, does it always have to be like this? And even just one easy thought experiment to ask is what we call the 50-50 if not, why not question. So every day the male champions are asking, well, wait a tick, if women are making up 50% of the population, and we're 50.8% the majority of the population, but if women make up 50% of the population, why aren't I seeing 50% on the graduate intake? Why aren't I seeing them on the leadership program or whatever it is? And in fact, one of the CEOs of the big banks recently did this because he was brought a list of candidates for the global leadership program. That's a really important promotional gateway to senior leadership in the bank. And there were only 23% women. So he said to them, well, why are they on 50-50? If not, why not? Why am I only seeing 23%? HR ran off, came back and said, oh, look, we made a mistake, we've missed a few women. To 26%. He said, no, you are not hearing me. I'm asking 50-50, if not, why not? And they, to cut a long story short, what they realised was that the eligibility criteria to get on this course was you had to have run an overseas office. I mean, how many people with caring responsibility are going to be able to do that? So they started thinking about that and they said, no, this is about having a global mindset. That's what should be the criteria. Do you interact with clients overseas, etc., etc.? So at the end of the day, they got 48% women on that course, and he said it's the best course they've ever run. So they're the things that have to be challenged, I think.
Yeah, just a quick observation about this middle there, being a barrier. I think one of the things that's not often discussed is the nature of ownership of design firms. The population of partners who own firms. And it's not just the middle there, it's the pretty senior. One of the things I would observe about the argument around getting change in law firms and accountancy firms and pretty significant size design firms is they all have roughly the same ownership model, which actually precludes me because it rewards longevity rather than rules. However long that rules might be. It might be that it's a relatively fractured trajectory. It might be a few years here, a few years there. As long as you can keep some form of connection, it should be rewarded. So the observation I would have as not being a designer by background, but running creative firms is looking at what other creative firms do, is the nature of the ownership structure might actually mitigate at its very core against progress of women. That's not something that's readily on the agenda to be discussed.
Sounds bold, no, I'm up for it.
I really said it.
It's almost my Tony Jones moment, and we'll just take that as a comment as we wrap up. But look, let's continue the conversation, but let's do it outside with a drink. I know there's glasses under your seats, so I'd like you to take those. We've run out of glasses. Such is the turn up. But before you go, can we just have a round of applause for this?